exactly an expert witness is and what it does. Can you just explain the whole concept of what an expert witness is to start?
Yeah, I will. Obviously, anyone can Google what the definition is, but from our perspective, when we're hired as an expert witness in a litigation, regardless of the party that we represent, really coming to the table and leveraging all our experience, both theoretical and practical, from an impartial standpoint. And I say that specifically because regardless of who we're representing in the litigation case, we come into it looking as a neutral party and following the breadcrumbs from the beginning of the project to where it actually became a legal case. So we actually look at this from a neutral, impartial, as I mentioned, perspective of understanding truly what is happening across, whether it's the software vendor, the system integrator, even the client, where things kind of started falling apart, and providing, again, our expertise in working with clients today from a live perspective. We do actually do quite a few assessment cases as well. Clients will hire us midstream when they start getting a sense that a project is off the rails, and we follow very much the same effort. Those tend to be 2 to 3 months. Litigations can be years, so the duration is really different. But ultimately, we kind of still look at the trail of the breadcrumbs from beginning to the end, and really understanding from our perspective, collective perspectives being a client as well as consulting firm, where things, again, started going off the track.
Right. So in these cases, you typically have a plaintiff, of course, that is typically, and not always, but typically it's the company that was implementing technology, that the end customer is typically the plaintiff, and they're suing typically either the software vendor and or the party that implemented the software, and that's the defendant in most cases. Sometimes the software vendor will end up suing or countersuing the plaintiff. But when we're looking at these cases where company fails in their implementation, they sue software vendor and or system integrator or implementer, who's well, first of all, who do we typically represent? Our team, or which side?
Most often it's the client, the entity that actually secured the software, secured the SI, and is one paying the bill for the implementation is typically the one that feels the brunt of a project that has failed, either at the beginning or at the end.
Right. And of course, there are times where software vendor or system integrator hires us as well to be on the defense. Sure. But it does seem like over the years, I don't know why this is, but it seems like it's sort of trended the direction you're talking, which is more the end customer that ends up being that more commonly hires us. But when we're looking at these cases, then you've got the side that we're on, which is typically the plaintiff, but not always. And then you've got the defense, typically the software vendor, not always. Whose fault is it typically when we're doing these cases?
It's interesting when we start having conversation with the legal team, the attorneys that are actually ultimately the group that hire us on their client's behalf. We have a level set up front that we're going to look at this, as I mentioned earlier, in an impartial, unbiased view. And so far, in my experience as being part of the expert witness cases that we've worked on in the past, rarely is one party 100% at fault. And we set that tone up front. There is quite a bit of fault on the client side, on the plaintiff side, when a lack of understanding of what this kind of project is going to happen, lack of oversight of the SI. So we look at this again from an impartial perspective, but typically we see the burden is on the vendor side. They're the experts. That's why they were hired. The contract is being paid by the client. So it's really the burden of success falls on the technology team that's hired. Again, that's the expertise that the client is looking for. Again, there's a number of fingers to point on the client, on the plaintiff side as well. But typically what we see is the rigor and the approach of how the implementation is progressing is really on the vendor side to get it right and declare any kind of issues or risks along the way so that it never gets to litigation in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that's a good overview. And, I remember my first expert witness case. I didn't even know what an expert witness was. I kind of knew, I've watched TV and have seen the concept of expert witness, but I didn't really know what expert witness meant in the context of our industry. And I remember it was the waste management versus SAP case. This was probably 15 or 17 years ago. when that lawsuit happened. And that was the first time I had ever done expert witness work. It was about 15 years ago when those attorneys contacted me for that case. And so for me, that was a really memorable one because I got to learn what an expert witness was while I was being an expert witness on one of the most publicized failures in recent memory. But from your perspective, without mentioning names necessarily, can you describe the biggest or the most complex or the most memorable expert witness case that you've been involved with so far?
Yeah, and appreciate that question. It's interesting because I look through all the cases that we've worked on in the past, regardless of industry, whether it's retail, manufacturing, distribution. The challenges come up, again, not speaking names, but of course, many of the software platforms were the large ones, SAP, Oracle, and the like. What really becomes a challenge and issue around the complexity is those clients that have spent 20, 30 years developing proprietary software. They haven't really gone out to the market and looked at off-the-shelf systems, especially the scale of an ERP or other enterprise systems. And they get into the process of, I want the new system that is multi-tenant in the cloud. Functionality is kind of homogeneous at some level. And I want the system to do exactly what we did internally from a developed system for 30 years, day one, and I don't want any customization. And so the complexity of some of these cases, we had a retailer, they manufacture but also distribute other products, where they would look at outgoing shipments, and we're talking thousands of shipments a day out of their manufacturing and distribution center, and they would reset who gets that product on a daily basis. So the complexity of how to release product back into inventory, allocate that inventory to the highest priority customers that day, and then assign the product that may have been part of a previous order the day before, gets reassigned to a new order because that customer is more important to them. And to do that at the scale that multi-billion-dollar company, most out-of-the-box, off-the-shelf systems can't handle that kind of processing. So we can talk about some of the challenges of why that project even got to that state. But really, the complexity comes from those individuals, those clients that have developed their own software, so it's very unique to them, or they have never really done something like this before. And so the complexity isn't just the technology, but the project itself. And in one of the cases, and I'm sure we'll get into it today, one of the challenges, and we see this happening often with the client side, most often the plaintiff client, is the fact that they turn the keys of the implementation over to the system integrator. They don't know this. They don't understand what's going on. Here, make us happy. And that generally starts the process of disconnect around the phases of the project. And that's usually when there's issues of delay in the project, overruns on budget that come around. But really, it's the sophistication of the homegrown systems, regardless of the industry, that really trips up a lot of outside system integrators and software vendors from our perspective.
Yeah, that complexity is a great point. Every business has their complexities, but there's some obviously that have more complexities than others. And it's always interesting when we're in these cases, or when we analyze these cases. One thing that you alluded to is you get to do that forensic analysis where you get to see every single artifact and every single email, every single piece of documented proof that this implementation ever happened. We get to see that. So every email that is exchanged, all the sales presentations, the contracts, the status reports from the project, the steering committee presentations.
Right.
We look at all that stuff, and you typically see, the discussions that lead up to that discussion around complexity and that sort of thing. And one of the things that's really interesting in these cases, a lot of times software vendors will say, well, you're too complicated. Just use the software the way we built it, and that'll make things less complex. But it's not always that easy, as we saw with that case you just mentioned, the manufacturer and distribution company. You can't just change that overnight, a way that a company's been doing business for decades or sometimes longer. So that's super interesting.
Well, an interesting point to call out is we get called in because the quote unquote implementation has failed. But we almost always start our assessment projects, as obviously our legal expert witness cases as well, is how the project got started during the selection phase. Typically, we see that it's really the ambiguity, the soft approach during the sales cycle and the selection process that really starts this project off on the wrong foot. The challenges of seeing this wonderful stuff at a conference, having more demos of fixed functionality, and then just doing a lot of head nods and agreement that, oh yeah, your unique processes, we can handle that, don't worry about that. And then they go off and secure a 5-7 year contract on licenses, a 5-year implementation, and then get into very loose requirements. And then the implementation, again, as I mentioned, starts off on a very poor setting. So rarely is the implementation itself the failure. It usually is indicative of how the sales cycle and the selection worked in the first place. And to that point, when we get hired, Third Stage gets hired to do system selections. We rarely start looking at, these are the systems we would recommend right up front, right? It's more about what is unique to you. A lot of these, again, multi-tenant SaaS, ERP, enterprise solutions are meant to be used out of the box. And many of the functional areas of these ERPs are just that. They're blocking and tackling. Financial, accounting, procurement, those tend to be competitive advantage for our clients, right? So we want to really focus on, during the selection phase, what's unique about you. What are those processes of that functionality that you will not use out of the box? And that's usually when we start figuring out what is that smaller pool of systems that could be worked in that environment. Rarely is, again, I mentioned the blocking and tackling, right? How do you receive shipments? Typically is not a competitive advantage for our clients. It's more about, as I mentioned, that other legal case, how product is assigned to an order and shipped out, how they deal with customers from a CRM configuration effort. Those are ones that are the tricky ones. Everything else that a lot of the ERP platforms support are just that, just basic platform foundational functional areas that aren't a competitive advantage. So those areas tend not to be tripped up in a implementation that goes south.
Right.